Today we're going to be looking at two of the more powerful editing functions found within Pro Tools. One of them is the relatively recent Elastic Audio, and one is the venerable Beat Detective, which has been with us for quite some time, although it's taken on a slightly different appearance in recent years. We're going to be using a musical example here. It's a song by Billy Joel. Looking at the basic interfaces of these two, um, again, tools, if you want to call them that, this is the Beat Detective interface. It's three basic sections to it. We'll get in depth in a minute. But first, I wanted to do a little review of Elastic Audio to point out some of its strengths and some of its shortcomings. And pretty much the shortcomings are why we still have Beat Detective. So let's take a look at Elastic Audio and some of its benefits, which is that, as you know from having used it, we can stretch the audio in either real or render time, depending on the quality that we need. It's a very easy way of looking things. There aren't a bunch of extra dialog boxes. It's relatively easy to use, meaning, as you know, you just drag the warp markers around and essentially it's stretching the audio. And after you've done so, we've got several algorithms that we can choose from depending upon what our musical material is, whether it's rhythmic, monophonic, polyphonic, etc., or Verispeed for that matter. Useful for creating special audio effects, so we can do an overstretch, in which case some of the audio here will turn kind of a pinkish color, and that could be really useful for trying to create a stretched low tone, for example, like a big boom. We can use Elastic Audio to adhere to tempo ruler changes made after recording the audio. This is really useful if we needed to change the tempo of a piece of music or session to 110 beats per minute after it had already been recorded at 102 beats per minute. And the quality, dependent upon the algorithm that you're using, is very good for Elastic Audio. So again, here's how we instantiate. And you'll see here that I've actually created a couple pull downs. So basically what I've done here is I've created alternate versions of a track uh, with this track playlist selector. You'll see here when I show you the demonstration in a minute, we've got a version that's the original version on this vocal percussion track, and then we've also got one that is the fixed or Elastic Audio version. Um, and the track view selector, of course, this is where we select from, where you'll see playlists generally by default. We would check the warp option in order to get into warp view, which will, instead of just looking at a waveform, allow us to look at the audio in this manner. So a little video, and this is from a session, as I'd mentioned, from that Don't Ask Me Why recording. And so you can see here that just some of the standard things that had been done in pre-production ahead of time, setup of the location markers, and also looks like we're going to listen to this now to hear what the recording sounds like. So we solo it. Back to the mix view because we're going to solo safe the click track. And it's kind of a sloppy performance, isn't it? I have to tell you, it sounded better than that, but we've made it sound really bad for our original version. So what's going to happen here is we're going to go to this playlist selector, and the playlist, you'll notice here there's also an EA or Elastic Audio version. If you look really carefully here, you'll see that the waveform sort of snaps. So it's sort of like a quantization. So we go back to our memory location, and we're also going to look at what's going on in warp view here. And in this process, we're holding down the shift button, actually. That's what you saw there with that arrow. It's a shift key modifier. So what we can do here is if we go into grid editing mode, we could go through and snap each one of these bits of waveform, which is what had been done. And you'll notice now that the performance sounds a lot better. As I'd mentioned, we would typically toggle on grid mode to give us those constraints so that we can drag the waveform one way or the other so that it constrains to the subdivisions of the beat. And then we've got our Elastic Audio plugin selector. Again, that's where we instantiate specifically the algorithm in question. And here we obviously wanted to use rhythmic because we're dealing with very much rhythmic vocal percussive material. All right, so some tools here that we could also use, especially the grabber tool here, where we're going to be dealing with grabbing these audio selections in this next little demo. So we're getting started here. The track is called Wash. It's a washboard, which is a very common instrument to have in a sort of a New Orleans Zydeco type of style. And locating to our next location here. Again, I've created sort of a safety, or I am creating a safety playlist here. So I'm duplicating a playlist, and I'm going to give it a name, Wash Edits. And again, really common to be working in grid mode in this sort of situation. So we got this really subdivided part here. So we're going to kick into 16th notes here. And this is where we instantiate our Elastic Audio plugin. It's got that little triangle looking icon. And we select the rhythmic algorithm. It's rhythmic, not pitched. So as I'd mentioned, the grabber tool just a moment ago, the reason that we're selecting that right now is we're going to drag or move some of these warp markers around. I like to call this TIE Fighter view. This is where you hold down the Shift key. See here that we're able to sort of snap these transients into place without disturbing surrounding events. So it's because we're holding down that key modifier, that Shift key, that we're allowed to do this without disrupting any of the audio that comes either before or after the audio that we're working on. So if we wanted to, we could quantize this. It's just a matter really of showing you that if we needed really fine control over a really specific part of the session, that this is another possible way of going through and straining each of these transients to our grid. And the timings that are being shown are measures, beats, and clocks or ticks, which are subdivisions of the quarter note, as you know. So from the track view selector, we go back to waveform now, and essentially we're just going to loop out our improved washboard track. So all the timings are correct now, and to create more material here. This is common in a recording situation if you only have something recorded for 4 bars, and it's essentially doing a copy and paste type of operation. But you'll notice again that little elastic audio symbol. Now it's in the left-hand side of the screen. And so that's telling us, hey, that's been fixed. We've been using the elastic audio plugin there. And by releasing that way, you'll notice now that we've extended the corrected material. So it's all good stuff. So you always want to make your fixes, your corrections, obviously, before you perform a copy and paste operation. So we go back to the mix view here. We're just going to pull down a fader on that piano that's sort of jarring. Well, what do you know? right, so pretty well in the pocket now. On to the next slide here. And this is where we get into its counterpart, I guess you could call it. Beat Detective has been around for a long time. And the big thing that sets Beat Detective apart as far as an advantage goes is the fact that if we're working on multiple tracks at once, especially a drum kit, where we've got lots of tracks or channels for one instrument, remember that you're going to have a little bit of bleed, right? For example, you'll get a little bit of kick drum in your mic, in your snare drum mic, and vice versa. So we need to make sure that we edit or nudge all of these parts of the drum kit in exactly the same way. Otherwise, we get all of these phasing issues, which sounds sort of like a comb filter or, as we talked about recently, flanger type of effect. It's a really unpleasant sound when it's not intentional. So some of the benefits, and take a look at the three sections here. We've got three that we're talking about: this operation section, selection section, and a detection section. And we're going to go a little bit more into detail on each of these in a minute. But Beat Detective is great because it doesn't really require any of your processor, unlike Elastic Audio. Again, it's less risky, and there are issues, or they have been historically in Pro Tools, where Elastic Audio can crash. It can corrupt a file as well, in which case you have to go to a session backup, and joy does not ensue. So Beat Detective is more or less immune to those types of issues. It's just a matter of undoing a few times if you need to. It's a legacy feature, and that just basically means that everybody's got it. It's been around Pro Tools since the dark ages. We can do what's called groove quantizing, and we'll be doing an exercise on groove quantizing in the next few days, which means that if something was recorded with a swing feel, but for whatever reason we had, I don't know, a really square drummer, and he or she was playing with a straight eighth note feel, that we could make the alteration. It's called a groove quantization to make the drum sound swinging. It's very useful for joining together audio via conforming and smoothing. You can see in the operations section on the left-hand side that those are the bottom two options. It's really great tool. It's overlooked a lot of the time for creating these batch fades. And it also works on MIDI regions. And this is really useful if we had to do tempo mapping, like if we had somebody who'd sent us a MIDI file but had been recorded freely without a click, then it would be really useful for us to drop down from that operation menu. I can't do it right now, but we would go from audio and change that to MIDI. So there are certain functions that are audio only, and we'll talk a little bit about those in Beat Detective. The basic dialog here, which provides us control over the Beat Detective functions. And I want to take a moment and just tell you about some of the things that Beat Detective could be useful for. So Beat Detective analyzes audio or MIDI selections. It identifies peak transients or accented notes, and it generates what are called beat triggers. We're going to see those, and they are based on the detected rhythmic elements, transients generally speaking. So using those purple lines or beat triggers, Beat Detective can do some things that are really useful for us. I talked about the MIDI aspects, so we can extract a tempo map from a freely recorded audio or MIDI performance. So that would be useful if we needed to extract a tempo map from audio that was recorded without a click, or for MIDI that was recorded without a reference to a session tempo. We can create the groove templates. I talked about the swing a minute ago. So we can extract the rhythmic feel from an audio or MIDI performance as a groove template, which can then be used to apply the feel of the captured performance to other audio selections or MIDI data. It's very cool. We can conform audio to a tempo map. This is probably the most common application, and it's what we're going to look at in this little video in a minute. So what I mean by conforming the audio to a tempo map, very similar to what we just did with the Elastic Audio, except here again, with a multi-track situation like a drum kit, this would be a great way to sort of snap our audio. So Beat Detective can conform the recorded audio to follow the session's tempo map, improving the timing of individual transients such as drum hits and quantizing them to the uniform tempo of the session. I'd mentioned the smoothing ability, which is essentially like a glorified batch fade. So Beat Detective's edit smoothing can be used to clean up tracks that contain many clips requiring trimming and crossfading, effectively removing the gaps of silence between the clips. And there are some other applications. Three that come to mind are loop matching. creating remixes and creating tick-based material. So those would be more sort of creative um, applications for Beat Detective. And this is Beat Detective in action over this really horrible cowbell part. Yeah, so it's pretty terrible. Again, I made it really bad. So, especially with Beat Detective, I think that these, I call them safety playlists, are a really good idea. So you can see that I'm creating another playlist. I'm calling it Cowbell Edits. And here comes the process. So we grab the region, we click on it, and of course these are now called clips. So what you're looking at the video region is now called a clip. The shortcut for Beat Detective is Command 8 on the keypad. I want to explain a little bit about each one of these sections. So at the bottom left-hand corner, we've got this, you see operation there. We've got bar beat marker generation. So generates bar beat markers corresponding to transients detected in an audio or MIDI selection. That's what we get there, and we'll be doing all this in some exercises coming soon. The groove template extraction I mentioned to you extracts the rhythmic and dynamic information from audio and MIDI data and saves the information either to the groove clipboard or to a DigiGroove template file. Region separation, which we're going to do here in a minute, separates and creates new audio regions based on transients detected in the audio selection. So essentially there's a threshold. It's sort of dictated. We'll see over here on this conform area is sort of where we determined a threshold using primarily the strength function over there. Region conform, so after you've done the separating procedure, you conform the audio to the grid, whatever that grid might consist of. Maybe it's triplet based, maybe not. And then again, editing smoothing, and the reason that the edit smoothing is important is if if you're cutting up audio and then reconforming and then playing back, you're going to get a lot of little pops in the audio, which aren't going to sound good. And editing the smoothing is a really quick way of creating these fractional 3 to 5 millisecond crossfades so that that doesn't have to happen. All right, so this is where we've got our beat triggers for the first time. That's those purple lines that I was telling you about. There's some key modifiers that we can use to do what are called promoting or inserting these beat triggers. So we've got these different levels of analysis, and we generally use enhanced resolution. But it's really important that we capture the correct selection. In other words, here Pro Tools, I have bars 48, beat 1 through 51, beat 4 selected. And you notice there with that sensitivity slider that's sort of like a threshold, if you will. So you'll notice that depending on how that was set, we had these beat triggers appearing or disappearing. What we don't want is we don't want too many beat triggers. We call those false triggers, and then we're going to be cutting up the audio in places where there's nothing going on. There's dead space, or there's certainly no transient. So we want to set the sensitivity level just high enough so that we're only getting the desired beat triggers. So 11% works well here. And you can see that I hit that separate button. And now I'm headed over to the operation area here. And I clicked region conform. And now you can see, there you go. Now you can see those transients are snapping. And those gaps represent actually errors in timing, if you want to look at it that way. Here's what this sounds like now before smoothing.